In the midst of a raging storm, the roar of a truck packed with explosives thundered toward a helpless crowd. But in that split second between life and death, a scarred figure leapt forward. Blaze the dog, who defied fate, throwing his body against the jaws of destruction. The explosion shattered, the night smoke engulfed everything, and when hope seemed lost, Blaze rose again, his eyes burning like an unyielding flame that refused to die. Subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss any of our dramatic and moving episodes. The auction house smelled of sweat, rust, and despair. Ceiling fans whirred lazily overhead, doing little to cut through the stifling Kansas heat that pressed down on the crowd like an invisible weight. Dust hung in the beams of light, cutting through slatted windows, catching the flicker of bodies shifting restlessly on wooden benches. The air vibrated with a feverish energy, part carnival, part execution. At the front of the room, beneath a banner that once advertised tractor parts, but now sagged in faded indifference, a rusted cage sat on a raised platform. Inside, a Belgian Malinois pressed its scarred flank against the iron bars. The metal screeched faintly as the dog shifted, the sound like nails dragged down the length of every spine in the room. "Devil dog," someone muttered, spitting into the sawdust scattered across the floor. Another voice echoed louder this time. "Put it down already." The crowd roared in agreement, their shouts swelling until they felt less like individual voices and more like a single violent current. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, eyes wide, faces lit by the kind of curiosity only the young dared bring to cruelty. Old men folded their arms across sun-creased chests, nodding in grim satisfaction, as if this ritual of condemnation was justice. The auctioneer, his jacket stained dark under the armpits, raised his gavel. The mallet hovered midair, a frozen guillotine ready to fall. His lips pressed into a line as he glanced at the crowd, as if to make sure no one would object when he declared the verdict already decided. In the cage, the Malinois snarled. Not the wild froth of a rabid beast, but the low, guttural sound of an animal who had been cornered too many times, beaten too often to trust the hand of any human. Foam clung to the corners of his muzzle, a grotesque crown of exhaustion. Chain scars ridged his neck like a grotesque necklace, reminders of hands that had once shackled him. His ears twitched, one torn at the edge, a flap of flesh dangling uselessly. But his eyes, God, those eyes, amber bright, defiant. They did not flinch. They locked onto anyone who dared meet them, holding their gaze with a steadiness that unsettled even the hardest men in that room. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "We all know what this one's done," he began, his voice cracking from too many cigarettes and too much whiskey. 3 incidents, 2 lawsuits pending. Town's tired of paying medical bills. He's dangerous. This here, he gestured to the cage with his gavel, isn't a pet. This is liability. This is blood waiting to be spilled. Applause, jeers, whistles. The crowd smelled blood in the water and wanted the kill. From the back of the room, a chair creaked. A figure shifted, pulling the brim of his hat lower against the glare of the ceiling light. Ethan Walker hadn't planned to stop here. He hadn't planned anything at all. Most mornings he drifted, caught between memories he couldn't escape and silence that threatened to swallow him whole. The auction had been a detour, a way to avoid driving home to an empty house that still smelled faintly of smoke years after the fire. But now his gaze was locked on the dog in the cage. Ethan's eyes were tired, ringed with the sleeplessness of a man haunted. His shoulders slumped with the weight of ghosts, Sarah's laughter, Emily's small hand wrapped around his finger. The last night replayed endlessly, flames devouring wallpaper. The crack of beams snapping under heat screams, cut short by smoke. A hasty investigation, no clear answers. Official cause, electrical fault. Official conclusion, tragedy. But nothing about it felt finished, nothing about it let him breathe. The dog snarled again, and something flickered across Ethan's face. Recognition. Not of the animal itself, but of the sound. He had heard it before in alleyways where addicts pulled knives in warehouses, where raids went wrong in the belly of men and dogs who refused to die quietly. It was the sound of survival stripped of dignity, raw and unrepentant. The auctioneer raised the gavel higher. No bids. The order is clear. This animal is $300. The words landed like a gunshot. The room froze. For a breathless second, no one moved. Even the dog seemed to pause, ears pricked, eyes narrowing as though uncertain whether he'd heard correctly. The gavel wavered in the air. The auctioneer blinked. "Sir," he said finally, voice cracking, "what did you just—" "I said 300. The chair screeched against concrete as Ethan stood. His boots thudded across the floor, each step deliberate, echoing louder than the hush that had fallen. He reached for his wallet, his movements calm as though buying a loaf of bread instead of interrupting an execution. Gasps rippled through the hall. People craned their necks, whispering, their voices jagged with disbelief. "That's Walker. Lost his wife and kid, didn't he? Crazy bastard, always was soft. He's lost his damn mind." An old woman clutched her chest, her knitting needles clattering to the floor. A young boy peeked around his father's legs, wide-eyed, as if witnessing treason. Ethan stopped at the front, mere feet from the cage. He looked at the dog, really looked at him, and something unspoken passed between them. Two broken things battered by fire and chain meeting in silence, where words could never go. The auctioneer stammered. "Sir, you don't understand. This animal is—" "I understand," Ethan cut in his tone, flat, steady as steel. He placed the bills on the podium, the green crisp against the auctioneer's trembling hands. 300. That should cover it. A murmur rose in the crowd, swelling into anger. "He's gonna kill someone. That dog's cursed. You can't take that thing into town." Ethan ignored them. His gaze never left the animal. The Malinois pressed closer to the bars, eyes locked on the man who'd just rewritten his fate. His body was taut, muscles coiled, ready to spring if given the chance. But there was no hostility in his stare, only calculation, suspicion, tempered by something faint but undeniable hope. The auctioneer swallowed hard, lowered his gavel and muttered, "Sold." The word cracked like thunder. Ethan reached for the cage door. Metal squealed as it opened, the sound dragging across every nerve in the room. The dog didn't lunge. He didn't cower either. He stepped out slowly, paws silent on the wood, his head lowered, but his eyes never leaving Ethan's. Whispers hissed through the crowd, sharp as knives. Parents pulled children closer. Men spat curses under their breath. But Ethan didn't look at them. He bent slightly, extending his hand, not close enough to threaten, not far enough to dismiss. The dog's nose twitched, breath hot against Ethan's fingers. The tension stretched thin as wire. Then, with a cautious grace, the animal took a single step closer. The crowd groaned, some with disgust, some with unease. Ethan straightened, clipped the leash to the dog's collar, and turned. Without another word, he walked down the aisle. The Malinois followed stride, silent amber eyes sweeping the crowd like a soldier scanning for threats. The aisle parted reluctantly, people leaning away as though proximity itself might infect them. Outside, the air was no cooler, but it was different, quieter. Crickets rasped in the tall grass beyond the gravel lot. The sky stretched wide, painted in streaks of fire as the sun bled into dusk. Ethan paused at his truck, the weight of 100 eyes still pressing from behind. He opened the passenger door. The dog hesitated, sniffed the air, then leapt inside, settling with a wary grace. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself a breath, though it shuddered with the weight of everything unspoken. He glanced back once at the auction house. Through the cracked door, he could still hear the voices, angry, incredulous, condemning. "Fool! Dead man walking! Both of them cursed!" He shut the door, climbed behind the wheel, and started the engine. Gravel crunched under the tires as the truck pulled away, carrying two shadows into the growing night. Neither spoke, but neither needed to. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel entirely alone. And in the silence of the cab, the dog's breathing was steady, measured a rhythm that matched his own. The crowd would talk, the town would judge. But for now there was only the road stretching into darkness and the strange, fragile tether between a broken man and a scarred dog, two castaways bound together by a choice no one else dared make. And somewhere deep inside, though, he would never admit it aloud, Ethan Walker felt the faintest flicker of something he thought long dead possibility. The gravel drive to Ethan's house stretched long and lonely, a scar cut through fields gone to weed. The truck bounced along the ruts, suspension groaning in protest, each jolt rattling the loose glove box and the bottles clinking under the seat. Inside the cab, the silence was alive. The dog Blaze, though Ethan had not yet named him, sat rigid, pressed into the passenger door, hackles bristling, lips curled in a muted growl that rumbled like distant thunder. His body was coiled taut with distrust. Every time Ethan's hand shifted near the gear shift, the growl deepened. His amber eyes locked on the man beside him with an intensity that could burn through steel. Ethan didn't flinch. He knew that sound too well. It was the same noise he used to hear when kicking down doors, guns drawn, flashbangs smoke choking the air, dogs caught in cages starved until their bones jutted like broken fence posts taught that survival meant teeth and blood. Blaze was no different. He was bred to obey, broken to kill, and then discarded when his usefulness ended. Ethan's jaw tightened as he kept his eyes on the dirt road ahead. "Easy," he muttered, voice low and even, not really expecting obedience. "Ain't nobody gonna touch you here." The growl didn't fade, but it didn't rise either. Blaze's ears flicked back at the sound of his voice, uncertain, calculating. That flicker of hesitation gave Ethan the tiniest sliver of hope, a fragile thread stretched between two creatures who had lost everything. The house appeared over the rise, like a ghost too stubborn to disappear. Once white, the paint had peeled into gray strips that fluttered in the evening wind like abandoned bandages. The porch sagged under its own weight, board split nails rusted to orange rot. Windows cracked from storms, and time reflected nothing but the fading sky. The place smelled faintly of char, though the fire had been years ago. Ash embedded in the bones of the walls, smoke trapped deep in the wood where no amount of scrubbing could reach. Ethan pulled the truck to a stop, killed the engine. The sudden silence pressed heavy, broken only by the creak of cooling metal and the steady growl beside him. He turned his head slowly. Blaze's body trembled with restrained violence, muscles rippling beneath the scarred coat eyes darting between the door handle and Ethan's hands, as if weighing which direction meant freedom. Ethan reached across, careful, deliberate. His fingers closed around the leash, clipped to the collar. Blaze stiffened lips, peeling back teeth flashing in the dying light. For a moment it felt like holding a live wire, a single wrong twitch enough to spark an explosion. "Not here to hurt you," Ethan murmured. He opened the door, stepped out, and tugged gently. The dog resisted, nails scraping the truck's interior, a sound that sent a chill through Ethan's chest. Then, with a violent jerk, Blaze leapt down, landing in the gravel with the grace of a predator. His body stretched forward, pulling hard against the leash head, low growl vibrating through the night. The walk to the porch was a battle. Blaze lunged at shadows, an old fence post, a fluttering plastic bag, the rustle of grass in the wind, as though each were an enemy waiting to strike. Ethan's arms strained against the sudden jerks, but he held firm, jaw clenched, sweat gathering at the nape of his neck. He didn't curse, didn't yell. Years of training had taught him better. Anger was gasoline. Calm was water. Inside the house was colder than the air outside, as though the fire had stolen not just warmth, but the very soul of the place. The living room was sparse, a couch sagging in the middle, a coffee table scarred with cigarette burns, a television that hadn't been turned on in months. On the mantel above the fireplace hung a single frame, the glass cracked in one corner. Behind the spiderweb of fractures was a photo, Sarah, her smile radiant. Emily on her hip, both caught in a moment of light before the world collapsed. Ethan's eyes lingered on it as he led Blaze inside. The dog stopped at the threshold nails, clicking against the wooden floor nose, twitching at the unfamiliar scents. He growled again, deeper this time, ears pinned back. His body quivered as if the walls themselves were a threat. Ethan gave the leash slack, lowering himself to one knee. His voice calm but firm. "This ain't no cage. No chains. Just a house. Mine. Yours if you want it." The dog didn't move closer, but he didn't bolt either. His breathing slowed fractionally, chest rising and falling like a storm struggling to settle. That night, Ethan spread an old blanket in the corner, set down a bowl of water, and retreated to the kitchen. He left the leash clipped to the collar, but tied it loose enough for Blaze to pace to test the boundaries. In the silence, Ethan stood at the sink, staring at the cracked tile backsplash, where soot stains still lingered like fingerprints of the fire. His hands braced the counter. He exhaled long and low. For the first time in years, the house wasn't silent. The sound of claws on wood, the low rumble of warning, the restless pacing, it was life. Uneasy, dangerous, unpredictable life. But life nonetheless. The next morning came gray and damp. Ethan stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee, the steam curling into the chilled air. Blaze was tethered to the post, pacing in circles, eyes tracking every movement with suspicion. When Ethan stepped closer, the dog bared his teeth, pulling against the leash until the post groaned. "Hell of a roommate," Ethan muttered, sipping his coffee. It was then he heard the crunch of gravel from the road. A car door shut, followed by the steady, deliberate rhythm of footsteps. Ethan straightened, every muscle taut, until he saw her. Margaret Collins moved slowly, but with purpose. 72, her back slightly stooped, her silver hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. She wore a faded cardigan despite the morning's damp chill, and her sensible shoes crunched softly against the driveway stones. In her hands, a small basket lined with a checkered cloth, something warm tucked beneath it. "Morning, Ethan," she called, her voice carrying a strength that belied her age. Ethan frowned. Margaret rarely came by uninvited. A widow who kept to herself, she lived 2 houses down the road, though neighbors felt too generous for the distance between them. Since the fire, she had spoken to him, only in passing a nod, a murmured greeting at the mailbox. Now here she was, standing at his gate, eyes not on him, but on the dog, straining against the leash. Blaze's growl sharpened, his entire body rigid, ready to strike. Margaret's eyes softened. She didn't step back. She didn't flinch. She simply stood there, studying him the way one might study a long-lost photograph. "He's a Malinois," she said softly, as though the words were meant more for herself than for Ethan. "Military breed. Intelligent, loyal if you can earn it." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You know dogs. My son had one." Margaret replied, her gaze still locked on Blaze. "Iraq. Unit depended on him. Said that dog could sense things before they happened. Saved their lives more than once." Her voice trembled just barely. Ethan heard the catch and looked away, giving her the dignity of not noticing. Margaret stepped closer, ignoring the rumbling growl. Blaze lunged forward, teeth-bared leash jerking tight. Ethan moved instinctively, hand snapping to the rope muscles straining to keep the animal back. But Margaret didn't retreat. She lowered her gaze to Blaze's level, her voice calm, almost maternal. "You've been hurt," she whispered. "I can see it in your eyes." The growl faltered, caught in his throat. Blaze's body still shook with distrust, but his eyes, those amber eyes, flicked just for a moment away from Ethan and toward her. A spark of recognition, as though she had spoken a language he remembered. Margaret smiled sadly. "Reminds me of Duke," she murmured. "My son's dog. Came home in a flag-draped coffin, but they said Duke went with him, never made it back." Ethan's jaw clenched. He looked at her, then really looked. Margaret's face carried the weight of years' wrinkles, carved not just by age, but by grief. Her eyes glistened, but her voice held steady. She set the basket down on the porch. "Brought biscuits." "Not for you," she added with a faint smile. "For him." Blaze's nose twitched, drawn by the unfamiliar scent. He growled again, softer this time, conflicted. Ethan loosened his grip slightly, watching, waiting. Margaret crouched slow and deliberate until she was nearly eye level with the dog. She didn't reach for him. She simply opened the basket, placed a small biscuit on the ground, and slid it forward with one finger. Blaze's ears flicked. He sniffed the air eyes darting between her face and the treat. The tension stretched taut as a wire. Then cautiously, he stepped forward, nostrils flaring. His teeth hovered over the biscuit body taut, ready to flee at the slightest twitch. Finally, he snapped it up, retreating a step, but not lunging, not snarling. Margaret exhaled softly, a sound halfway between relief and sorrow. "Good boy," she said, her voice breaking ever so slightly. Ethan watched silent, his chest heavy with something he couldn't name. For years his house had been a mausoleum filled with ghosts and ash. Now, standing on his porch, he saw a scarred dog taking food from the hands of a scarred woman, both bound by grief, both reaching across an abyss. And for the first time since the fire, Ethan felt the faint tremor of possibility stirring again. Not hope, not yet, but the fragile outline of it. The day broke sharp and brittle Kansas sunlight cutting through the haze with the unforgiving glare of a welder's torch. Ethan had barely slept. Blaze's restless pacing through the night had been like a drum beat against his nerves. Claws scratching the floorboards, throat rumbling with low, warning growls at every creak of the house. At dawn, Ethan had surrendered to exhaustion and poured himself coffee black and bitter as old grief. He sat at the kitchen table, mug cradled in both hands, staring at nothing in particular when Blaze stiffened. The dog's ears snapped forward, his body, rigid tail quivering in the kind of tension Ethan had only ever seen in trained canines. The growl came next, short, urgent, not at Ethan, but at something unseen beyond the walls. Then the howl erupted, piercing and primal, vibrating through the wood like a war horn. Ethan spilled coffee across the table. What the hell? Blaze lunged toward the door muscles, straining leash, clattering against the leg of the chair where Ethan had tied it. The dog howled again, high-pitched and frantic, a sound that didn't belong to aggression, but to alarm. Instinct snapped Ethan out of his fog. He grabbed his jacket, yanked the leash free, and let the animal drag him outside. The morning air carried a strange heaviness, a chemical bite that prickled his throat. Blaze pulled hard nails, ripping clumps from the dirt road, his body possessed by singular purpose. Ethan fought for balance, half running, half stumbling behind. The trail led them 2 blocks down, past shuttered shops and empty yards, to a squat bungalow sagging under years of neglect. White paint peeled in curls from the siding. Curtains swayed in the open windows. And in that moment, Ethan smelled it too, the sour tang of gas. Blaze lunged at the front steps, barking, howling claws raking the wood. Ethan's pulse spiked. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, slamming against the door. "Anyone in there?" A faint cry answered. High, fragile, the sound of a child. Adrenaline surged like an electric current. Ethan's shoulder rammed the door once, twice, until the wood splintered and gave. Blaze shot through the opening like a bullet, his bark booming against the walls. The interior reeked of gas so thick, Ethan gagged. He yanked his sleeve up over his mouth, eyes watering, scanning through the dim. "Where are you?" he shouted. A whimper. Then he saw her. A little girl, maybe 6, crouched in the corner by a toppled lamp. Her tiny hands pressed over her ears. She coughed violently, eyes wide with terror. Flames hadn't sparked yet, but the gas hissed audibly from somewhere in the kitchen. Ethan dropped to one knee. "Hey, I'm here. You're okay. We're getting you out." Blaze was already there, nose pressed to the girl's shoulder, whining urgently, nudging her toward Ethan. The dog's body blocked her from the leaking kitchen muscles, taut eyes glowing fierce with purpose. Ethan scooped the child into his arms, her frail body shaking against him. He turned for the door, Blaze at his side, growling at the invisible threat filling the house. Each second stretched the air heavier, thicker, begging for a spark to ignite hell. They burst through the doorway, Ethan stumbling down the steps, clutching the child. Blaze leapt ahead, barking furiously. And then it happened. The explosion tore the house apart in a roar that split the morning sky. The blast hurled Ethan forward, heat slamming against his back like a furnace door ripped open. Board splintered windows shattered into glittering shrapnel. He hit the ground hard, rolling to shield the girl with his body. Blaze skidded beside them, ears flattened, teeth bared against the inferno that consumed the bungalow in seconds. Ethan's ears rang. His vision swam. The child sobbed into his chest, alive. That was all that mattered. Alive. He forced himself up, coughing eyes darting to Blaze. The dog shook himself, body streaked with soot, eyes fixed on Ethan as if demanding confirmation. Mission accomplished. Neighbors spilled from their houses, drawn by the blast. They gathered in clusters, hands over mouths, eyes wide with disbelief. Whispers cut through the smoke. That's the Mitchell guy. Isn't that the dog? The killer dog. He dragged him there, saw it with my own eyes. Save the girl. The words were brittle, sharp with confusion. Only hours ago, half the town had sworn the animal was a demon that needed destroying. Now they watched him stand guard over a child plucked from fire and gas. His chest heaving, his amber eyes scanning for threats like a soldier on duty. The girl's mother burst through the crowd, shrieking her daughter's name. She collapsed to her knees, clutching the child as if to fuse their bodies together. Ethan stepped back, his muscles trembling from the aftershock, his eyes stinging from more than smoke. Blaze didn't retreat. He stood near the girl, head lowered, gaze flicking between her and the encircling crowd. When the mother sobbed thank yous into Ethan's chest, Blaze barked once, sharp, commanding, and only then did he sit, ears twitching, eyes watchful. The fire crews arrived minutes later, hoses blasting foam into the wreckage. The chief shouted orders. Men moved like a hive, but Ethan barely heard them. The ringing in his ears drowned it all, leaving only the pounding of his heartbeat and Blaze's steady panting. Someone pointed. That's him. That's the mutt Walker bought at the auction. The crowd murmured. Some faces shifted, doubt flickering in eyes that had once burned with condemnation. Others stayed hard, distrust etched deep, unwilling to yield. But the narrative had cracked. The beast had saved a child. That was undeniable. Ethan looked down at Blaze. The dog was filthy, his fur scorched at the edges, but his eyes were bright, unbroken. For the first time, Ethan reached out, fingers brushing the scarred head. Blaze stiffened, then just barely leaned into the touch. That night, the story spread like fire through the town. At Murphy's store, at the diner, at the gas station, voices tangled in disbelief. The Walker dog pulled a kid from a gas explosion. Can't be true. Saw it myself. Maybe he ain't a monster after all. But in Ethan's house, silence reigned again. He sat at the kitchen table, knuckles raw, lungs sore, staring at the wall where Sarah's photograph hung. Blaze lay in the corner, body curled, breathing deep in exhausted sleep. For a moment, Ethan let himself believe the house was alive again. Not with ghosts. With something else. Something new. The following afternoon, Margaret knocked. Ethan opened the door to find her holding another basket, steam rising from inside, the scent of cinnamon drifting into the cool air. Her eyes studied him, then drifted to Blaze, who stood stiff at her side, tail. Stiff ears angled back. News travels fast, she said simply. Whole town's buzzing. Ethan grunted. Half of them think I'm insane. Other half want to string us both up. Margaret's smile was faint, worn at the edges. And a few are rethinking. She lifted the basket. Thought he might like these. Biscuits, homemade. Blaze's nose twitched. He growled low and uncertain, then fell silent, his eyes locked on her. Margaret stepped forward, crouched slow, and placed the basket on the porch. She didn't reach for him, didn't push. She just sat back on her heels, letting the scent drift. You were brave yesterday, she said quietly, though her gaze was on the dog. Both of you. Bravery doesn't erase scars, but sometimes it makes them mean something. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. You think he can change their minds? Margaret looked up at him, her eyes sharper than he expected. No. But he can change yours. The words hung between them, heavier than smoke. Blaze stepped closer to the basket, sniffed, then took one biscuit gingerly in his mouth. He retreated a step, chewing slowly, his eyes never leaving Margaret's. She smiled, tears brimming at the edges of her tired eyes. Ethan felt something shift deep in his chest, something brittle cracking under the weight of the moment. For years he had lived with ashes. Now on his porch with a scarred dog and a scarred woman, he wondered if ashes could feed new fire. The fire started just after midnight. Ethan heard the sirens before the smoke reached his porch. At first he thought it was just another dream, one of those fevered nightmares, where fire consumed everything, Sarah's voice calling from the flames. But Blaze was already up, hackles raised, pacing the front door with a sound vibrating deep in his chest. The dog's instincts were never wrong. Ethan shoved into his boots, grabbed his jacket, and followed. By the time they reached the stables on the edge of town, the night sky glowed a sickly orange. The horse farm belonged to Richard Halloway, a man known for his quick temper and quicker debts. People were already gathering along the fence line, silhouettes lit by the inferno that devoured the barn's roof. Sparks clawed at the darkness. Horses screamed from inside, wild-eyed with terror. Ethan ran toward the shouts. Fire crews scrambled with hoses, water arcing uselessly against the blaze. Richard staggered near the gate, his shirt soaked with sweat, shouting about insurance, about how everything he owned was burning. "Jesus, those horses," Ethan snapped. "Anyone inside?" A firefighter shook his head. "Too hot. We got most of them out, but a few." His voice broke under the crack of collapsing timber. The smell of accelerant, sharp and unnatural, stung Ethan's throat. He froze. That wasn't just wood and hay burning. He knew the smell. He'd smelled it in crime scenes and warehouses torched for payout. Gasoline. Blaze lunged against his leash, dragging Ethan toward the barn's side wall. His barking split the chaos, urgent, demanding. Ethan fought to hold him back, but the dog was relentless, nose to the ground, pulling toward a darker patch of dirt near the building's corner. "Walker," someone shouted from the crowd. "Get that damn mutt out of here before he bites somebody." Ethan ignored them, crouching low as Blaze pawed frantically at the earth. His nails scraped up clumps of grass slick with fuel. The stench hit Ethan full force. His stomach turned cold. This wasn't an accident. Someone had poured accelerant around the barn. Blaze whined, digging faster, his body shaking with intensity until his muzzle struck glass. Ethan reached down and pulled up a shattered bottleneck, sticky with residue. Gasoline. He stood slowly, the crowd's noise dulling as he raised the evidence. This fire he called his voice carrying wasn't an accident. All eyes turned. Richard froze, his face pale despite the glow of the flames. "What the hell are you talking about?" Blaze barked a sharp, accusing sound that made the crowd flinch. Ethan held up the bottle. He found this. Gasoline. Somebody wanted this place to burn. The murmurs spread fast. "Arson insurance, Halloway's been drowning in debt." Richard's voice cracked as he tried to shout them down. "You don't know what you're saying. That dog's dangerous. It doesn't know what it's sniffing." But Blaze barked again, louder, and lunged toward Richard with such sudden force Ethan nearly lost his grip. The leash strained, the dog's teeth bared, not snapping, not attacking, but pointing, accusing, his whole body aimed at the man. The silence that followed was suffocating. Eyes darted from Richard to the burning barn, to the scarred dog straining against Ethan's hold. "Crazy mutt," Richard stammered. "It don't mean anything." Yet the crowd wasn't convinced. They had seen the dog save a child days earlier. They had seen him howl before disaster struck. Now they watched him dig truth out of the dirt with his own teeth. And the narrative split. Some voices rang with awe. He knew. God Almighty, he knew. That dog saved more than a kid. He's saving the truth. Others hissed with doubt. It's coincidence. Could have been there from anything. You really trust a beast like that over a man? The fire crews finally doused the last of the flames, leaving behind a smoldering ruin. Horses huddled in the paddock, trembling, their eyes rolling white. Richard was taken aside by deputies, his protests echoing hollow into the night. Ethan stood with Blaze at his side, his hand tight on the leash, his heart hammering with conflict. When he got home, the silence pressed harder than before. Blaze paced in the living room, restless amber eyes flicking to Ethan with an intensity that was unbearable. The dog had proven himself again, first saving a child, now unearthing a lie. But Ethan could already hear the town's whispers sharpening into knives. He poured whiskey into a glass, stared at it for a long moment, then shoved it aside untouched. He sat at the kitchen table, elbows on the scarred wood, staring at his hands. They were shaking. "Damn you," he muttered to no one. "Damn you for making me believe again." Because belief came with risk. Belief meant caring, and caring meant losing. He had lost everything once. The thought of losing again carved open wounds that hadn't healed. The next morning, voices rose at the diner. Half the town was calling Blaze an angel, a guardian sent to protect them. The other half spat words like, "curse omen freak." Betsy Morrison swore he was possessed, that no dog could smell gasoline in the ground unless the devil guided him. Others argued back, pointing to the girl alive because of Blaze to the evidence in Ethan's hands. The line in the sand was drawn, and Ethan stood in the middle. Every glare, every whispered insult, every tentative nod of gratitude pressed on him like a weight. His chest ached with it. He drove back to the ranch, Blaze riding shotgun, silent but watchful. The road shimmered with heat. Ethan's mind roared with doubt. Keeping the dog meant more fights, more pressure, more stares that judged him as broken as the animal at his side. And yet, when Blaze shifted closer, resting his scarred head against Ethan's shoulder for just a heartbeat, Ethan felt something raw tear through the walls he had built. Connection. Fragile, terrifying, undeniable. That night he stood in front of Sarah's photograph glass, cracked across her smile. Emily's small hand frozen forever, mid-wave. His voice broke as he whispered, "What the hell am I supposed to do with him? What if they're right? What if he's just a storm waiting to happen?" Blaze stirred in the corner, lifted his head. Amber eyes steady on Ethan, as though answering without words. And Ethan realized the fight wasn't between the town and the dog. It was inside him. Between fear and faith. Between loss and the terrifying possibility of belonging again. The Kansas night was heavy-stitched with the restless hum of cicadas. Ethan sat on the porch, a cigarette burning low between his fingers, though he hadn't smoked in months. He wasn't thinking about the fire at Holloway's barn anymore. He was thinking about the way Blaze had gone for the dirt, how precise, how focused, how utterly sure. That hadn't been luck. That was training. Blaze lay sprawled at the edge of the porch, his chest rising and falling. But his eyes weren't closed. They never truly closed. He watched the tree-line ears flicking at every whisper of movement, every rustle of wind. His body never seemed to understand rest. Ethan took another drag, the ember flaring against the dark, and finally said it out loud. "You weren't just some stray." Blaze's ears twitched, head tilting at the sound of his voice. Ethan blew smoke into the night, jaw tight. "You've done this before. Too many times to be a mistake. Somebody trained you. Somebody used you." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, studying the dog's scarred silhouette. "And God help me, I need to know who." The question haunted him, carried into sleep when it finally dragged him under. That night his mind was not his own. The dream was not his either. It was Blaze's. He saw flashes through the dog's eyes, blurred but sharp in their violence. A warehouse at night, shadows moving fast, men shouting in a language Ethan only half understood. The reek of oil and sweat. Blaze running low, belly scraping dirt, his ears pinned flat against his skull. A handler's voice barked commands. Gunfire snapped. The air was alive with panic. Ethan's chest tightened as the dog launched forward, muzzle pressed against a crate, barking until his throat burned. Then the explosion, wood shattering metal, screaming men scattering into the dark. Ethan jolted awake, drenched in sweat. Blaze was already staring at him from the corner, amber eyes reflecting something Ethan couldn't name: recognition, maybe even shame. Ethan swallowed hard, rubbed his face and muttered, What the hell did they make you into? The next day, Margaret came by. She always knocked softly as if the house might break if struck too hard. Ethan opened the door to find her standing there with a covered dish, the smell of baked bread trailing in the warm air. But her eyes were different that morning. Tired, pained. "Thought you might want this," she said. But her voice carried the weight of something unsaid. Ethan stepped aside, let her in. Blaze rose immediately, body-stiff eyes locked on her with that strange flicker of recognition he never gave anyone else. Margaret froze, then knelt slowly, extending her hand. "I swear every time I look at him," she whispered, "I feel like I'm staring back through time." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Margaret lowered herself into a chair, setting the dish on the table, with hands that trembled just slightly. "My son," she said. The words caught in her throat, and for a long moment she stared at them unseen in the air between them. Finally, she forced them out. "Daniel, Iraq." He was 24, smart, kind, too young for what they made him do. Her voice faltered, but she steadied herself. "He had a dog over there, a Malinois. Said it was the only thing that kept him sane. They used them to sweep compounds, sniff out explosives, keep the unit alive when men couldn't. He used to write me letters about that dog, how it was more than a partner. Said sometimes it knew danger before the soldiers did. He loved that animal like blood." Ethan listened in silence, his jaw set. Blaze sat close, ears angled forward, eyes fixed on Margaret, as if he understood every word. "The day Daniel died," Margaret said, her voice breaking, "they told me the dog was lost in the chaos. Gone. I never even knew its name. Just gone." She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "But when I look at Blaze, something in me remembers. The way he stands. The way he watches. It's like I've seen it before." Ethan felt the air grow heavy. He thought of his dream, of the flashes of violence he had no right to see, of the scars etched deep into Blaze's body. His stomach clenched. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that no two dogs were alike, that this was coincidence. But Blaze moved closer, then pressing his muzzle gently against Margaret's knee. Her hands trembled as she stroked his head. Tears slid down her cheeks. "Oh God," she whispered. "You've seen too much too, haven't you?" Ethan turned away, staring at the photograph of Sarah and Emily on the mantel. His chest felt like it was splitting open. Margaret's grief wasn't foreign. It was the same color, the same taste as his own. Loss carved into bone. For a long time, the house was silent, except for Margaret's quiet sobs and the steady rhythmic breathing of the dog. When she finally spoke again, her voice was raw. "You know what I see when I look at him? Not just pain, not just scars. I see survival. I see what Daniel never got the chance to be. Maybe that's why I can't stop coming here. Maybe I just need to believe that some part of him came back, even if it's only through this animal." Ethan's throat burned. He wanted to tell her not to hope, not to pin her broken heart on something as fragile as a dog. But he couldn't. Because when he looked at Blaze, he saw it too. The soldier. The survivor. The piece of himself that had been lost in fire and war and grief. Margaret wiped her cheeks, straightened her shoulders. "Don't waste the chance, Ethan. You lost family. I lost mine. But maybe we've both been given another shot. Don't throw it away because you're afraid." Blaze lay at her feet now, calm, his eyes closing slowly, trust flickering like a candle flame. For the first time since Ethan had dragged him from that cage at the auction, the dog seemed at peace. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as if the cracked plaster might give him an answer. His voice was low, almost a growl. They used him in the worst of it. Smuggling rings, gun runners. I can feel it when he dreams. The commands, the explosions. They broke him for their wars, their money. Margaret looked at him, her eyes steady despite the wetness still clinging to them. And yet here he is, choosing to stay, choosing to protect. She reached down again, her fingers tangled in Blaze's fur. "Don't you see? He's not broken, Ethan. He's proof that broken things can still save lives." The words cut deep, sharper than Ethan expected. He closed his eyes, exhaled slow. Blaze shifted closer, resting his head against Margaret's frail legs, and Ethan realized the truth he'd been fighting. This wasn't just about a dog anymore. It was about redemption, hers, his, maybe even Blaze's. Outside, the wind picked up across the Kansas fields, carrying the scent of earth and smoke. Ethan stood, poured himself coffee instead of whiskey, and watched the dog and the widow sitting together as if they'd always belonged. For the first time in years, the silence in his house didn't feel empty. It felt full, heavy, alive. But with that fullness came the weight of responsibility. Blaze's scars weren't just his past. They were warnings. He had been forged in violence, twisted into a weapon. And Ethan knew weapons always had a way of finding their wars again. As the night deepened, he whispered under his breath, "If they come looking for you, I'll be ready." Blaze lifted his head, eyes catching the dim light, and Ethan swore the dog understood. The first sign came as dust clouds on the highway. Ethan was fixing the back fence that afternoon, the board still blackened at the edges from a grass fire last year, when Blaze froze. The dog's head shot up, ears rigid, nose flaring toward the east. A low growl rumbled from his chest, deep enough to vibrate in Ethan's ribs. He followed the dog's gaze. Out on Route 6, a convoy of vehicles rolled toward town, black SUVs with tinted windows that didn't belong on Kansas backroads. Too polished, too deliberate. Ethan's hand tightened on the hammer. He'd seen those cars before in stakeouts, in raids gone bad, in places where violence was currency. Blaze began to pace, the fence line, hackles raised, amber eyes locked on the approaching dust trail. His body was coiled like wire, torn between instinct to attack and instinct to flee. Ethan knelt, hand gripping the dog's collar, whispering steady into his ear, "Easy, boy. Not yet." But his own heartbeat betrayed him, pounding harder with every mile the vehicles closed. By evening, whispers had spread through town. The newcomers had taken rooms at the roadside motel, flashing rolls of cash at the clerk who didn't ask questions. Strangers with tattoos curling up their necks, eyes cold and watchful. They moved in pairs, slow and certain, the way predators marked territory. At the diner, people dropped their voices. At Murphy's store, women pulled their kids closer. Everyone could feel it, danger had arrived. That night, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, staring at the single envelope that had been slid under his door. No stamp. No return address, just his name scrawled in block letters. Blaze had sniffed it, growled, then sat in the doorway, like a sentry refusing to leave. Ethan tore it open, a single sheet of paper. "Stay away from the dog. He belongs to us. Last warning." His fist clenched until the paper crumpled. His throat burned with a fury he hadn't felt in years. "Belongs to us." As if Blaze were property. As if the scars carved into his body were some kind of brand. He looked across the room. Blaze was watching him, head tilted, silent but knowing. Ethan exhaled slow. "They're here for you, aren't they?" The dog didn't move. He didn't need to. The truth hung between them, heavy as smoke. Margaret came the next morning, her arms wrapped around a grocery bag filled with bread and apples. She noticed immediately. The envelope lay on the table, flattened now, but the words still screamed from the page. She touched it with trembling fingers. "Who?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Men I used to chase. Only now they've come chasing back." Margaret's face went pale. Her eyes flicked to Blaze, who sat stiff at her side, gaze pinned to the window. "They want him, not just want," Ethan said. His voice was hard-clipped. "They think they own him. He's a piece of their machine, and they've come to drag him back." Margaret swallowed. Her voice cracked when she spoke. "You can't let them. If you give him up..." "I'm not giving him up," Ethan snapped. He hadn't realized how sharp it would sound until the words cut the air. Margaret flinched, but then her expression softened. She saw what burned in his eyes, not just anger, fear. She sat slowly, the groceries forgotten on the counter. Then you need to understand what this means. They don't ask twice. They don't forgive. Ethan rubbed his face with both hands. Images flashed behind his eyelids. Sarah's smile, Emily's laugh, fire swallowing everything. He had failed once, failed to protect the only family that mattered. And now? Now fate had delivered him a second chance in the shape of a scarred Malinois with amber eyes. He would not fail again, but fear was already sinking into the town. That evening at the feed store, Mrs. Morrison confronted him. Her voice carried sharp and scalding. "Walker, that dog's cursed. First the fire, now strangers sniffing around. You brought this down on us." Others murmured agreement. Some avoided his eyes. A few stood near him, silent, loyal, but the divide was clear. Half the town saw Blaze as salvation. The other half saw him as a fuse, burning toward disaster. Ethan didn't argue. He turned, walked out with Blaze pacing at his heel, every step echoing louder than words. But inside, the fight churned. Keeping Blaze meant putting everyone in danger. Letting him go meant betraying the only bond he had left. That night, the knock came. Not Margaret's gentle tap. Not the sheriff's heavy hand. 3 sharp raps, quick and deliberate. Blaze was at the door instantly. Body rigid, a growl tearing from his throat so deep it rattled the windows. Ethan moved slow, every nerve alight, his pistol tucked into the waistband of his jeans. He cracked the door. A man stood there in the porch light. Mid-40s, shaved head, a scar cutting down his cheek like a blade's memory. His smile was wrong, too calm, too certain. "Evening, Officer Walker." The man said, his voice smooth as oil. Or should I say, ex-officer. Ethan didn't answer. Blaze pressed against his leg, growl rising. The man's eyes, flicked to the dog, lingered. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you. You know it. I know it. Everyone in this town will know it soon enough. Best thing you can do is hand him over and forget he was ever here." Ethan's hand tightened on the doorframe. His voice was low, steady. "Not gonna happen." The man's smile widened, but his eyes stayed cold. "You think you saved him. Truth is, you just stole him back from us. He was bred for a purpose, trained for a war bigger than you can imagine. He doesn't belong in your kitchen. He belongs with men who know how to use him." Ethan's stomach twisted at the word. Use. That was all they saw, a weapon in fur, nothing more. He wanted to slam the door, wanted to put a bullet between those dead eyes. But the man leaned closer, voice dropping to a whisper that sliced through him. "You've already lost a family once, Walker. You really want to lose another." Ethan froze. The threat was too clear, too personal. Blaze snarled, teeth-bared body quaking to launch forward. Ethan shoved the door shut, bolted it, his heart hammering like gunfire in his chest. The man's laugh echoed through the night as footsteps retreated down the gravel drive. Inside, Ethan leaned against the door, breath ragged. Blaze pressed against him, the dog's body hot and trembling. Ethan dropped his hand to the scarred head, gripping hard, grounding himself in that solid presence. "They're not taking you," he whispered. "Not while I'm still breathing." But the threat hung in the air, thick as smoke. And for the first time since the fire years ago, Ethan felt the same helpless weight pressing down, the certainty that danger was already inside his walls. Blaze settled by the door, eyes locked on the night, his body still tense. Margaret's words echoed in Ethan's head. They don't forgive, they don't ask twice. The town had seen Blaze as a miracle, then a curse, then a savior again. Now, they would see something else, the reason wolves had come to their door. And Ethan knew the war was only beginning. The night had gone heavy with silence, the kind that feels too intentional, too arranged. Out across the Kansas plain, the wind had died, the cicadas muted as if the whole world was holding its breath. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, pistol laid bare beside his hand, a bottle of whiskey untouched at his elbow. Margaret was in the chair across from him, her knitting in her lap, but her fingers, motionless eyes fixed on the window, as though she could see the threat waiting outside. Blaze prowled the room, muscles twitching, tail stiff, every step measured. The dog had been restless for hours. He knew. Ethan rose, walked to the front window, parted the curtain with 2 fingers. Nothing but darkness and the faint outline of trees. Yet his gut tightened, that old cop's instinct whispering danger. He checked the clock, just past midnight. That's when Blaze froze, head snapping toward the back door. His ears pitched forward, his chest rising, and the low rumble started in his throat, vibrating so deep it rattled the panes of glass. Ethan's stomach clenched. He grabbed the pistol, motioned Margaret to stay down. Blaze's hackles bristled like wire as he crept toward the door. Then, without warning, the dog exploded into motion. He lunged through the screen with such force the hinges screamed. Ethan shouted, rushing after him, gun raised. Margaret's voice cracked behind them. Ethan. The night split with snarling. Blaze slammed into a figure half hidden beneath a cottonwood tree at the edge of the yard. The man cursed, a gun flashing in his hand, but the dog was faster, teeth sinking into his arm, dragging him to the dirt. The shot fired wild, a crack that tore through the night bullet, sparking against the fence post inches from Ethan's chest. Ethan dropped to one knee, pistol steady, sights trained. "Drop it!" he roared. The man screamed. Blaze's jaws clamped tighter, blood slicking his sleeve. The gun fell into the dirt. Ethan kicked it away, heart hammering. Blaze growled low, pinning the man with a weight far greater than flesh and bone, amber eyes blazing with fury. For a moment, Ethan saw it, the soldier's dog, the weapon forged in blood and fire. But then Blaze looked back at him, waiting. Not for permission to kill, but for direction. Ethan's throat tightened. He exhaled slow. "That's enough, boy. Stand down." Blaze released, stepping back, chest heaving, teeth bared but restrained. The man curled, clutching his shredded arm, cursing in Spanish between gasps. Ethan crouched, yanked him upright by the collar. "Who sent you?" The man spat blood, his face twisted with pain. "You know who." Ethan slammed him against the tree. "Say it." The man laughed bitterly. "You're already dead, cop. You, the old woman, the dog. Doesn't matter when." His eyes gleamed with hate, and Ethan recognized it, the fanatic's loyalty. He wouldn't talk. Sheriff Rodriguez arrived minutes later, lights cutting across the yard tires, spitting gravel. Deputies hauled the bleeding man into the cruiser. The sheriff lingered, his face drawn, his words quiet, but edged with warning. "You've stirred a nest, Ethan. They're not just passing through. They're here, and they're hunting." When the cars pulled away, silence fell again. Ethan stood in the yard, Blaze pressed close at his side, Margaret gripping her shawl against the chill. The old woman's face was pale but steady. Her voice broke the quiet. "They won't stop." Ethan looked at her, saw the truth in her eyes. He wanted to tell her it would be fine, that he'd protect her, protect the town. But he couldn't lie. His own voice came rough. "No, they won't." They went back inside. Margaret sat at the table, her hands trembling as she poured coffee. Blaze lay near the door, head up, ears twitching at every sound. The house smelled of gunpowder and fear. Ethan holstered his weapon, then leaned against the counter, staring at the woman who'd become his only ally. "We can't keep running defense," he said finally. His voice carried that old weight, the one from briefing rooms, before raids, from nights when survival was a coin toss. "They'll keep coming until one of us is in the ground." Margaret met his gaze, her jaw set. "Then what do we do?" Ethan looked at Blaze, the dog's amber eyes reflecting the low light, the scars carved deep into his muzzle. Blaze didn't blink. He was waiting, as he always did, for Ethan to choose. Ethan's chest tightened. "We fight. We stop waiting for them to decide when the next move comes. We make the move." Margaret inhaled sharply, then nodded. Her voice was steady now, steel wrapped in grief. "Then we do it together. You, me, and him." She reached down, laid a hand on Blaze's head. The dog leaned into her touch, and for a heartbeat, the room felt less like a war zone and more like a pact. Ethan poured himself a coffee, black and bitter, the kind that kept him alive in darker years. His voice was low, almost a vow. They want a war. We'll give them one. The house settled into silence again. But it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence before the storm. Outside, the wind had returned, rattling the trees, carrying whispers of violence across the Kansas fields. Blaze lay down at the door, eyes still wide open, a sentinel carved from flesh and loyalty. Ethan sat across from Margaret, their eyes meeting across the scarred wood of the table. Neither spoke again because they both understood. The fight was no longer coming. It was already here. The storm broke with more than rain. At first it was just the roll of thunder beyond the fields, the smell of electricity thickening the air. Ethan had been pacing the living room, pistol heavy in his hand. Margaret knitting with trembling focus in the kitchen, as if the rhythm of needles could hold the world steady. Blaze was restless, too restless. He kept circling the windows, ears pricked, every muscle taut like wire. His growls came in low vibrations, more warning siren than sound. Then headlights flared at the end of the drive. Not one pair. 3. Engines low and steady, tires grinding gravel like teeth. Ethan froze, his chest tightening. He knew that sound. He had heard it outside raid houses in Kansas City and deserts overseas, just before doors splintered and blood hit the ground. "They're here," Ethan whispered. Margaret set the needles down. She didn't flinch. She adjusted her shawl rose with a slowness that looked deliberate, not frail. Blaze was already at the door, body coiled. Thunder cracked outside, rolling so deep the windows rattled. The first gunshot shattered the night. Glass sprayed across the kitchen as a bullet punched through the window lodging in the far wall with a vicious thud. Margaret ducked her hand, braced on the table. Blaze erupted, barking so violently the sound shook the house. Ethan dropped low, adrenaline burning his veins clean. He slid to the side of the window frame, raised his pistol, and fired into the night. The answering volley was immediate. 3 muzzles, flaring bullets, ripping through siding, tearing splinters from the doorframe. Blaze lunged forward, only to be yanked back by Ethan's sharp command. "Stay." The dog froze, snarling, but obeyed. Ethan's training returned like muscle memory. He counted the rhythms of the shots, marked the angles of the flashes. He fired back, controlled, precise, each round meant to warn and wound, not waste. 2 voices cursed outside. One screamed. "Back door!" Margaret shouted, her voice carrying authority that silenced Ethan's doubt. She had seen combat from another angle, her son's stories, her nurse's instincts. She grabbed the shotgun Ethan had leaned against the counter earlier and racked it with hands steadier than her years suggested. "I'll cover this side." "Margaret, stay low," Ethan barked, but there was no hesitation in her eyes. She crouched by the kitchen doorway, shawl sliding from her shoulders, her body small but unyielding. A shadow broke from the tree line, sprinting low toward the porch with a rifle gleaming in his hands. Blaze exploded through the door before Ethan could stop him. The Malinois hit the man mid-stride, 80 pounds of fury, knocking him flat into the mud. Teeth found flesh, ripped the rifle loose. The scream pierced through the rain. Ethan's shot followed a clean, practiced strike that sent the weapon skidding across the ground. Blaze held the attacker pinned, jaws locked around his forearm, until Ethan whistled him back. Blood slicked the mud, the man writhing as thunder rolled above them like war drums. 2 more figures advanced from the opposite side, muzzle flashes, strobing the night. Bullets screamed against the walls. Ethan dropped, rolled, returned fire. Years of rusted instinct polished themselves in an instant. Every move was clean, efficient, an echo of the cop he used to be. He hit one in the shoulder. The second fell when Blaze barreled from the shadows, his growl swallowed by the storm. Margaret's shotgun roared, the blast deafening in the confined kitchen. One of the intruders at the back door staggered, clutching his side, his weapon clattering to the ground. She pumped the action again, her face lit by lightning eyes blazing with something fierce, something maternal and unbreakable. Ethan slammed the front door shut, dragged a shelf across it for cover. The house reeked of gunpowder and rain-soaked earth. Blaze was panting, hard blood dripping from his muzzle that wasn't his own. He stood in the center of the living room, head lowered, chest heaving, daring anyone else to cross the threshold. The firefight slowed. Tires screeched outside, engines revving. Retreat. The surviving men hauled their wounded into the SUV's engines, howling as they tore down the road, their rage trailing like smoke in the storm. Silence fell, heavy, interrupted only by the hammer of rain on the roof and the hiss of wood splintering under stray embers. Ethan lowered his weapon chest, heaving his pulse thunder still in his ears. Margaret leaned against the counter, the shotgun loose in her hands, her face pale but unbroken. Blaze finally eased his growl, fading into labored breaths, amber eyes darting between them, waiting for the next command. Ethan wiped blood and rain from his face, his voice rough when he spoke. That wasn't a warning. That was the first wave. Margaret straightened, clutching the counter for balance. And we're still standing. He stared at her, then at the dog, whose body was still trembling with adrenaline. For a moment, the three of them simply looked at one another, man, woman, beast. Bound, not by blood, but by the fire of survival. But the truth pressed in fast and merciless. This was only the beginning. The gang wouldn't stop. Not after being wounded, not after being humiliated. They would regroup. They would come back with more men, heavier firepower, colder intent. Ethan holstered his pistol, his jaw clenched. His voice was a vow now low and burning. They want to finish this fine. Next time we'll be ready. Lightning split the sky, casting the battered house in stark white for a single breath. Blaze stood framed in the flash, fur-matted teeth, bared eyes fierce as firelight. The sight seared itself into Ethan's chest like a brand. He realized then this dog was no longer just something he'd saved. Blaze was the shield, the partner, the heart that had pulled him back into the fight. Margaret lifted her chin, her voice quiet but certain. Ethan, we can't keep pretending we're just surviving. We have to fight back. Outside, the storm raged on, swallowing their words in thunder. But the pact had been made. The gunfire was gone. But its echo lived on in every whisper, every shiver of curtain drawn across a window. Every bolt slid home after dusk. Willow Creek had always been a quiet town, the kind where gossip flowed faster than the river. But now fear was the currency. By morning, everyone knew. The gang was back. The drug runners who had once moved weapons and poison along the back roads of Kansas had returned, and they had not come quietly. The story shifted with every retelling. At the diner, old men swore they had seen 10 cars' headlights like a convoy of ghosts. At Morrison's feed, mothers claimed the attackers had carried machine guns, though only bullet holes in Ethan's siding proved any of it. But one thing never wavered: the belief that Ethan Walker had drawn this storm. Him and the scarred Malinois that followed him like a shadow. People avoided his eyes on Main Street, yet at the same time, they couldn't keep from staring. A few spat their contempt openly, muttering that he had cursed them all by keeping the devil dog. But others, quieter, more ashamed, began to look at him differently. Not as the cause of danger, but as the only man willing to stand between them and it. By midweek, Sheriff Rodriguez came to Ethan's porch, hat in hand, exhaustion carved into his face. "Town's restless," he admitted, voice low. "Some of them want me to run you out. But some are saying you're the only one who knows how to fight these bastards." His eyes flicked to Blaze, who stood at the porch rail, scanning the horizon with that same soldier's focus. "I don't like it, Ethan, but you might be the only shot we've got." Ethan didn't answer. He just scratched Blaze's ear, feeling the tension thrumming under the dog's skin like an engine wound too tight. That night, the storm returned, rain slashing across the rooftops. Thunder grinding the sky to pieces. Willow Creek slept uneasily, children waking in fits, parents clutching shotguns across their laps. Ethan patrolled the edges of his land with Blaze, the flashlight beam cutting through sheets of rain. Margaret stayed at the house, her Bible open on the table, though her eyes never left the door. It was Blaze who caught it first. He stopped dead, nose lifting to the wind, ears locked forward. His body stiffened, every muscle a live wire. Ethan followed his gaze and heard it then faint through the storm. A child's cry. Thin, ragged, lost. "Go," Ethan whispered. Blaze exploded forward, mud and water spraying under his paws. Ethan sprinted after him, lungs burning the rain, blinding his eyes. The cry grew louder, shriller, carried on gusts of wind. Then at the edge of the creek, swollen with rain, Ethan saw her. A little girl, no more than 6, clinging to the slick bank as the current tugged at her legs. Her small hands scrabbled at the mud, sliding, slipping. One more second, and she'd be gone. Blaze launched into the water without hesitation. The current swallowed him, pulling hard, but he cut through it like a blade. Powerful limbs surging against the flood. He reached the girl just as her grip gave way, caught her shirt between his teeth, and held her head above water. His eyes locked on Ethan's fierce, commanding move. Ethan dropped to his stomach, stretched out over the mud, rain pounding his back. "Come on, boy. Bring her in." Blaze fought the current, hauling the child inch by inch. The girl coughed, choked, her small body limp with exhaustion. Ethan's hand shot out, fingers locking around her wrist, pulling her up and onto the bank. Blaze scrambled after collapsing beside them, chest-heaving rain plastering his scarred fur to his ribs. The girl sobbed once, then clung to the dog's neck with tiny arms, burying her face in his wet fur. Blaze stilled, lowered his head against her shoulder, his breathing slow and deliberate, the picture of protection itself. Ethan's throat tightened at the sight. By the time he carried the girl back through the storm, neighbors had gathered lanterns, flickering voices, anxious. When they saw who he carried, when they saw Blaze at his side, the murmur ran like electricity through the crowd. "It's Clara," someone cried. "The Morrison girl, she's alive." Mrs. Morrison herself stumbled forward, the same woman who had led the petition against Blaze weeks earlier. She fell to her knees, clutching her granddaughter, tears streaming unchecked. "Oh, Lord, thank you," she sobbed, kissing the child's wet face, then turning toward Ethan and Blaze. Her eyes, swollen with grief and awe, landed on the dog. For the first time, no hatred lingered there, only trembling gratitude. The story spread faster than the storm itself. By morning, everyone knew. The child had been saved not by chance, not by human hands, but by the very creature they had once damned. Conversations shifted. In the bakery line, whispers carried a new tone. Maybe he ain't cursed after all. At church, voices hushed as Reverend Cole admitted from the pulpit that sometimes angels wore fur. Children who once hid behind their parents' legs now reached out tentative hands when Blaze passed. Ethan watched it all with wary eyes. Margaret saw it too, her hand resting on his arm as they walked through town one afternoon. "It's turning," she murmured. "They're starting to see." Ethan shook his head. "It won't matter if the cartel comes back with more men. Gratitude won't stop bullets." Margaret's gaze went to Blaze, who trotted ahead, ears high, amber eyes steady. "No," she said softly, "but maybe faith will." That night the town slept easier. Doors still locked, guns still loaded, but the fear was different now. Muted, tempered by hope. They no longer whispered about a cursed animal. They whispered about a guardian. Ethan sat on his porch. Blaze at his feet, Margaret dozing in the rocker beside him. The rain had cleared, leaving the night sharp and cold. Across the fields, lights flickered in windows. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the weight on his chest shift. Not gone, never gone, but lighter. He looked down at the dog who had dragged a little girl from death's grip, who had stood against men with guns, who had survived chains and fists and fire. Blaze lifted his head, meeting Ethan's gaze. There was no triumph in those eyes. No pride, only the calm, steady acceptance of what he was. Protector, survivor, soldier. Ethan whispered into the night, voice rough. "They're starting to believe in you. God help us, so am I." Blaze leaned closer, pressing his scarred head against Ethan's knee, and for a moment the world felt almost safe. But Ethan knew better. This was only a pause, the breath before the storm returned, harder, sharper, more merciless. And when it came, Willow Creek would look to him and to Blaze to stand in the fire again. The town square glowed under strings of lights looped between telephone poles, casting warm halos over carnival booths and weather-beaten banners. The annual Founders Festival was Willow Creek's pride, a tradition that survived droughts, floods, and wars. Tonight, the square pulsed with music, from the brass band laughter of children darting between food stalls and the crackle of fireworks, testers warming up for midnight. On the surface, it was joy. But beneath, Ethan felt the storm. He stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, shoulders tight. Margaret sat in a folding chair near the pie contest table, wrapped in her shawl, trying to wear calm. Blaze sat pressed to Ethan's leg, eyes scanning restless in a way Ethan had learned not to ignore. His ears flicked, his body stiffening every few seconds, as though hearing sounds no one else could. Ethan tried to let the music ease him. Tried to believe that maybe for one night, violence could be kept away. But his instincts gnawed at him. Too many strangers lingered at the edges of the festival, faces turned away when noticed. Too many cars parked farther down the highway than usual. Then Blaze rose. 1 second he was still, the next he was on his feet. Hackles bristling, a low growl vibrating through the ground. His amber eyes locked on something across the square. Without hesitation, he lunged, tugging the leash so hard it nearly tore from Ethan's grip. "Blaze, heel!" Ethan barked, digging in his heels. The dog strained harder, muscles rippling his growl, turning into frantic barks that cut through the festival noise. Heads turned. Conversations died. The band faltered. Ethan's chest went cold. He followed Blaze's gaze, and that's when he saw it. At the far end of the square, past the rides and food stalls, a delivery truck sat idling too close to the crowd, its lights off. Nobody inside moved. Nobody exited. Just the steady rumble of an engine in neutral, a beast waiting to pounce. Ethan's blood surged. He knew that sound, that look. Not just a truck, a payload. He grabbed Margaret's shoulder as he passed, his voice cutting like a blade. "Get people out. Now." Her eyes widened, but she didn't question. She rose, her voice sharper than any microphone, commanding mothers, fathers, children. "Move back to the church, hurry." The crowd hesitated, confusion, denial. But Blaze's frantic barking shattered their doubt. The dog lunged, dragging Ethan across the square straight toward the truck. Every second felt louder, the hum of the engine swelling into a scream in Ethan's head. He saw the driver's silhouette just as a flash of lightning illuminated the storm clouds gathering beyond the town. A man hunched motionless, waiting. Ethan's training returned with brutal clarity. A truck in a crowd wasn't coincidence. It was a bomb. He could see it in the way Blaze's body stiffened, in the way his nose flared nostrils, catching the chemical tang beneath the exhaust. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, breaking into a sprint. Blaze surged ahead, pulling with a force that nearly dragged him off his feet. He shouted over the square, "Clear the area now." Panic rippled. Parents scooped children, vendors, abandoned booths, music cut to silence. Margaret stood in the middle of it all, her shawl flapping like a flag as she directed traffic with a voice that brooked no argument. But the truck's engine revved, growling like thunder tires twitching forward. Ethan's gun was in his hand before he thought. He leveled it at the windshield, finger taut on the trigger. But Blaze was already ahead, streaking through the rain-slick grass, a blur of muscle and fury. The world slowed to a nightmare crawl. Ethan saw the driver's hand flick something metallic on the dash. He saw Blaze leap, teeth-bared, body stretched like an arrow. He heard Margaret scream his name. Then sound returned all at once, the roar of the truck, the chorus of terrified cries, Blaze's bark echoing like a war drum. Ethan fired. The bullet shattered glass sparks spitting from the cab. The truck jolted sideways, tires squealing. Blaze slammed into the driver's arm through the broken window, jaws locking down with bone-breaking force. The man howled, losing his grip on the switch. The truck swerved, fish-tailed, plowing into an empty booth, splintering wood and scattering pies across the rain-slick square. Ethan sprinted forward, yanked the driver's door open, and dragged the man out, slamming him into the pavement with a fury sharpened by fear. The man spat blood eyes, wild a sneer on his face, even in defeat. "You're too late," he hissed. "It doesn't end with me." Ethan's fist clenched his knuckles, aching to crush that arrogance. But he forced himself still, his voice low, shaking with rage. "It ends when you're all gone." Blaze stood over the man, teeth-bared, muzzle-stained chest heaving. Rain streaked down his scarred face, and in that moment, to the townspeople gathered at the edges of the square, he didn't look like a cursed beast. He looked like a savior. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "He saved us." The dog stopped the bomb. He knew before anyone else. For the first time, Ethan didn't hear fear in their voices. He heard belief. Sheriff Rodriguez pushed through the crowd, cuffs ready, deputies hauling the driver away. His eyes met Ethan's, grim and shaken. "We'll find out how much was in that truck. But if it had gone off..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Margaret stepped to Ethan's side, soaked her hands trembling, but her chin high. She looked at Blaze, who leaned against her leg, panting hard, but alive. "They'll never call him a monster again," she said softly. Ethan looked around the square at the townspeople clutching their children, at the band, clutching their instruments, at faces pale with fear, but lit with something new, gratitude. He felt it pressing in heavy as the storm clouds overhead. For the first time, Willow Creek saw what he saw. Blaze wasn't a danger. He was the shield. But Ethan's jaw clenched as thunder cracked overhead. This wasn't victory. It was warning. The cartel had shown their hand. And if they were willing to sacrifice a truck full of explosives in the middle of a town festival, then the war was far from over. He rested a hand on Blaze's soaked fur. His voice low, meant only for the dog. "You dragged me into this fight, boy. Now we finish it together." Blaze leaned into him, amber eyes fixed on the dark horizon where lightning split the sky. The storm wasn't done. Neither were they. The storm arrived like a beast unchained. Rain lashed, the square lights flickered, and the sky cracked open with thunder that rattled bones. People screamed, scrambling for cover beneath the awnings and into the church hall as the festival turned to chaos. Ethan's voice tore through the confusion, shouting orders, waving children towards safety. Margaret, soaked through but unyielding, guided the youngest by the shoulders, her shawl whipping like a flag in the gale. Then the sound came, the grinding roar of an engine pushed to its limit. Tires screeching against wet pavement headlights, cutting through rain. Ethan spun just in time to see it, a second truck, larger than the first, barreling down Main Street with monstrous speed, aimed directly at the cluster of townsfolk still trapped near the square's center. His blood froze. There was no time, no barricade, no chance. But Blaze moved. The Malinois bolted before Ethan could shout, his paws hammering against the flooded asphalt, water spraying in arcs around him. The truck's horn blared, the driver's face twisted behind the windshield. And then, in a moment that burned itself into every witness's memory, Blaze leapt. Time fractured into shards. Rain hung suspended, every drop like glass. Blaze's body stretched impossibly long muscles, straining scars carved deep into his hide. His jaws clamped down on the grill of the oncoming truck, his body colliding with brutal force, his weight and fury a living barricade. The sound was a scream of steel and flesh. Tires shrieked as the driver jerked the wheel momentum, stuttering. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. "Blaze," he roared, sprinting forward, pistol already raised. The square erupted with gunfire. Men poured from the shadows, cartel soldiers in black coats, rifles spitting flame into the night. Ethan dove behind an overturned booth, returning fire with brutal precision. Years of rusted training roared back his hands, steady despite the storm. Bullets hissed past splintering wood, cracking pavement. Through the chaos, he saw him, the leader, a tall man with a scar slicing across his cheek, eyes cold as glass. He strode through the square with deliberate calm, pistol steady in his hand, the storm painting him in strokes of lightning and smoke. This was the one who had sent them, who had brought the town to its knees. Their eyes locked. Ethan rose from cover bullets screaming between them. Their duel carved silence from the storm, every shot a line drawn in blood. Behind them, Blaze still held. His body dragged under the bumper teeth, locked legs scrambling against the pavement as the truck pushed forward inch by brutal inch. The townsfolk fled in waves behind him, their screams muted by the storm. Margaret turned back, once her face a mask of horror whispering prayers as she shoved another child toward safety. The leader advanced, firing with ruthless rhythm. Ethan countered, breath-ragged mud slick beneath his boots. One bullet grazed his arm, fire tearing through muscle, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The square's fate hung on this line. Then the truck detonated, a thunderclap inside a thunderstorm. The explosion ripped through the square, flames devouring wood and banners. The shockwave hurling bodies like rag dolls. Smoke rolled heavy, suffocating, lit orange by fire. Ethan hit the ground hard, ears ringing, his pistol skittering into the darkness. Silence, then coughing, then screaming. Ethan dragged himself up. Vision swimming rain mixing with blood on his face. The leader emerged through the haze, limping but alive, pistol still raised. His sneer cut through the smoke. "This is my town now, cop." Ethan staggered, fists clenched, searching for his weapon. But before the leader could fire, a shape moved in the smoke. Blaze. The dog rose from the wreckage, his body a tapestry of wounds, fur-scorched ribs heaving. Yet he stood. His amber eyes glowed through the haze like fire itself, fixed on the man who had brought ruin. With a roar that split the storm, Blaze lunged. The leader fired once, twice. Bullets struck, but the dog did not falter. He slammed into the man, teeth finding his arm, dragging him down into the mud. The pistol fired wild, cracking into the night sky before vanishing in the flood. Ethan saw it all in a blur, the fury of the dog, the shock on the leader's face, the storm wrapping them in smoke and fire. He stumbled forward, grabbed the fallen pistol, and leveled it with hands steady once more. "This is my town," Ethan rasped. And he pulled the trigger. The leader crumpled, his body limp beneath Blaze's blood-soaked frame. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain sizzling against fire. Margaret's cries echoed from the church steps, the townsfolk huddled together in terrified silence. Ethan lowered the pistol chest, heaving eyes locked on Blaze. The dog swayed legs, trembling blood streaking his muzzle. He staggered once, then twice, then miraculously straightened. His body was broken, but his spirit refused to yield. He limped toward Ethan, head bowed, tail flicking weakly. Ethan dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around the scarred animal, his voice breaking. "You're still with me, boy. You're still here." The square was ruin. Smoke clawed at the sky, banners burned to ash, the ground slick with rain and blood. Yet from the wreckage, the sight of Blaze standing broken, battered but unbowed, seared itself into every heart. To the town, he was no longer a monster. He was the wall that had held the guardian, that refused to fall. And in that moment, Ethan knew the fight was far from over. But they had survived the storm, together. The storm broke, leaving silence heavy and strange over Willow Creek. Smoke rose from the wreckage of the square, the smell of gasoline and scorched wood clinging to the air. Fire crews and deputies swarmed their radios, crackling with broken voices. But in the center of it all, where the bomb truck had detonated, a different kind of gravity pulled every gaze. Blaze stood, barely. His body trembled with the effort, his fur darkened by blood and soot, one ear torn anew. His chest rose and fell in ragged bursts. Yet his eyes, those burning amber eyes, still scanned the crowd, still demanded to know if his people were safe. Ethan had never seen anything like it. Not in Kandahar, not in the darkest nights of patrol. This was something that surpassed duty. It was devotion given form. Margaret pushed through the onlookers, her shawl clinging wet to her shoulders. Her face was pale eyes, why, not just with fear, but with something deeper. Recognition. She froze just a few feet from Blaze, her hand flying to her mouth. "No?" Her voice cracked. It can't be. Ethan turned to her, his arm still bracing Blaze. Grit. She shook her head, tears spilling fast. Her hands trembled as she reached into her coat pocket. From it, she pulled a worn, creased photograph, edges soft from years of being held too tightly. Ethan saw a young man in desert fatigues, his arm wrapped around a Malinois, both grinning under a sun that looked merciless even in the faded ink. The dog had the same scars along his muzzle, the same white blaze of fur across his chest. My son, Margaret, whispered, her voice breaking completely. Daniel and his partner's shadow. They were inseparable. Her knees buckled and Ethan caught her, steadying her as she pressed the photograph to her chest. They told me Shadow died with him. They told me. Her eyes rose to Blaze, her breath catching like a child's sob. But it's you. It's really you. The crowd hushed. Even the sirens seemed to fade. All eyes turned to the old woman and the scarred dog. Blaze tilted his head, his gaze locking on Margaret. Something shifted in him, then his body eased, his stance softened. Slowly, as if recognizing the pull of a memory buried under years of pain, he limped forward. Margaret dropped to her knees in the mud, her arms opening without hesitation. Blaze lowered his head into her chest, pressing against her as though no time had passed, as though the years of darkness had only been an absence waiting to be filled. Margaret broke sobbing into his fur, clutching him like a mother cradling her child. You came back, she whispered. God, you came back to me. Ethan stood frozen, his throat tight, every muscle locked against the wave threatening to crush him. He had thought his grief unshakable, a cage no one could breach. But watching Margaret with Blaze, watching her reclaim the peace of her son, she thought forever gone something cracked open inside him. A truth he had buried under scars and silence. Family wasn't just blood. Family was who stood with you in the fire and refused to let you fall. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. The townsfolk shifted closer, their faces. A kaleidoscope of awe and shame. These were the same people who had once spat the word monster at Blaze, who had signed petitions and whispered curses. Now they watched him with reverence, like a relic revealed in smoke and flame. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, their small voices trembling. He saved us. Sheriff Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice carrying over the square. This dog? He paused, his throat working. His hand swept toward Blaze, who still leaned against Margaret's chest. This dog saved Willow Creek tonight. Anyone who says otherwise will answer to me. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, rising into something stronger. Applause broke, hesitant at first, then swelling until the square echoed with it. Hands clapped, voices cheered. The sound rolled like thunder, but this time it wasn't destruction. It was recognition. Ethan glanced at Blaze. The dog's ears flicked his amber eyes, searching, but he didn't flinch. He stood tall despite his wounds, his tail giving the smallest wag as if he knew. As if he finally understood that he was no longer just fighting to survive. He was being seen. Margaret lifted her face, streaked with tears. But her voice steadied with a kind of strength only grief could forge. He isn't just a dog. He's a soldier. He's my son's partner. And he's our protector. She turned toward Ethan, her gaze fierce. Don't let anyone take him from us. Ethan swallowed hard, his voice rough when he answered. No one will. Not while I'm breathing. A child broke from the crowd. Then the same girl Blaze had pulled from the flood weeks before. Clara Morrison, her dress torn, her cheeks streaked with dirt. She ran straight to Blaze, throwing her small arms around his neck. You're my hero, she whispered. Blaze bent his head, resting his scarred muzzle gently against her hair. And that was it. Whatever walls remained in Willow Creek crumbled. Adults who had once crossed the street to avoid Blaze now stepped forward to lay hands on his back, whispering thanks through tears. A farmer pressed his hat to his chest. A teenager knelt beside him, stroking his fur. It was as if the entire town finally exhaled. Ethan looked on, chest swelling with something he hadn't dared feel in years: hope. He saw Margaret clutching her photograph, Blaze at her side. Clara pressed close, and for the first time since the fire that stole Sarah and Emma, he thought, maybe I've found my family again. The storm had torn their town apart, but in its wake it had left them something fierce and unshakable. A hero with scars, a boy turned warrior, a dog who had walked through hell and carried them out with him. Blaze was no longer an outcast, no longer a weapon abandoned by men. He was theirs. He was Willow Creek's. And in the glow of smoldering embers, the town crowned him the only way they could, with belief. Dawn rose over Willow Creek like a gift. The storm had passed, leaving the streets washed clean, the air sharp and cool, and the earth still breathing out steam from last night's fire and fury. The square that had once smoldered in ruin now rang with hammers and laughter. Boards were nailed, bricks, reset banners stitched anew. But beneath the rebuilding, something more powerful had taken root. Ethan stood at the edge of the green, a mug of coffee warming his hands. His arm was still bandaged, his ribs still sore from the fight. But for the first time in years, he felt lighter. Margaret sat nearby in her chair, knitting needles clicking with calm rhythm, her shawl pulled tight but her eyes alive with quiet fire. And at their feet lay Blaze, scars glinting in the morning light, his chest rising steady, his gaze fixed on the children darting through the grass. Those children were laughing again. And for a town that had nearly been silenced forever, the sound was salvation. Word of Blaze's stand had spread faster than the smoke. Willow Creek, once divided over the scarred Malinois, now carried his name like a prayer. Neighbors who had signed petitions for his removal now crossed the street to offer thanks. Farmers arrived with sacks of feed. Mechanics offered to fix Ethan's battered truck for free. And most surprising of all, Sheriff Rodriguez called a town meeting not to argue, but to celebrate. It was there, beneath the patched bunting and the charred clock tower, that Margaret's idea was born. She rose to her feet. Photograph of her son clasped in her hands, her voice clear and steady despite her years. We cannot let what happened here fade into memory. We cannot let Blaze's courage be a story we tell once a year while we hide from the next storm. We need to be ready, and we need to honor what was given to us. The murmurs rippled. Ethan watched her, his chest swelling with respect. Then she said the words that changed everything. We'll call it Blaze Watch, a rescue team not just of men, but of dogs, outcasts, strays, wounded creatures, given a second chance. Together, trained alongside the people of Willow Creek, they would become guardians. Not an army, but a family bound by vigilance and care. The town embraced it instantly. Volunteers raised their hands. Farmers offered land. The old schoolhouse at the edge of the field became their base windows. Repaired kennels built training grounds carved from earth, still damp from rain. The first morning of training arrived, bathed in golden light. Ethan stood in the field, his whistle sharp, his stance firm. Beside him, Blaze sat proud, scars no longer marks of shame, but emblems of survival. Around them, a dozen dogs of every size and breed bounded, rescued from shelters, pulled from chains, saved from darkness. Children laughed as they ran drills, tossing ropes, hiding in barrels for the dogs to find. Retired men, once idle and bitter, now leaned on canes while teaching hand signals. Margaret presided like a general, her knitting needles replaced by a clipboard, her stern encouragement drawing smiles even from the most hardened veterans. Blaze moved through them like a commander. He nudged a nervous hound into line, barked once to steady a skittish pup, bounded ahead to show the younger ones how to climb the stacked pallets. His tail wagged rarely, but when it did, it was like sunlight breaking through clouds. Ethan felt it building inside him as he watched hope fierce and unshakable. Not just for himself, not just for Margaret, but for every soul in this town that had thought itself too broken to mend. At dusk, the townsfolk gathered for the dedication. A simple pole had been planted in the square, its ropes creaking as the fabric unfurled. The new flag rose its colors, catching the last light of the setting sun. The emblem stitched into it was simple. The silhouette of a dog head, raised eyes forward, standing guard beneath the words, "Blaze Watch." The crowd cheered, voices raw with pride. Children waved miniature flags, their laughter carrying on the wind. Elderly widows wept openly, clutching the hands of strangers who no longer felt like strangers. Ethan stood with Margaret Blaze lying between them. The dog's head rested on Ethan's boot, his eyes half closed. But when the flag reached the top of the pole and cracked in the wind, he lifted his head. His ears pricked, his gaze steady on the sky. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached down, her fingers combing through Blaze's fur. Tears streaked her cheeks, but her smile was radiant. "He came back to me," she whispered. Then she turned to Ethan, her voice breaking. "And maybe he came to you too." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat thick. His gaze lingered on the dog, then on the people who had once abandoned him, now gathered as one. "Maybe he came to all of us," he said softly. The camera of life pulled back. The square filled with light and laughter. The kennels glowed with lanterns as dogs barked joyfully, no longer prisoners, but protectors. Children darted between them, shrieking with delight, their parents watching with tears of relief. The church bells rang not for warning, but for celebration. And over it all, the narrator's words lingered like truth carved into stone. Sometimes the souls we believe most lost are the ones destined to become our greatest heroes. All it takes is someone brave enough to give them a chance. The shot widened again. Ethan standing tall, Margaret steady at his side. Blaze stretched at their feet like a lion at rest. Behind them, the flag of Willow Creek snapped in the evening wind, a symbol not just of survival, but of rebirth. Blaze closed his eyes, his body scarred, but his spirit unbroken, the very heart of a town that had learned to believe again. And as the screen faded, one truth remained undeniable. Willow Creek was no longer just a place on a map. It was a promise that no one man or dog was ever truly beyond redemption.